Let's make one thing clear before I do this reaction video. I am a huge fan of Mark Manson. In fact, let me get his book. He is the author of this one, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Big Flying F. Hey, this is probably one of the most interesting and overly hyped, but deservedly so, books about improving your life, right? And if you haven't read it, I highly suggest you read it, but I like what Mark says in most cases. He really seems to be well thought out, and he has always given me a different way of looking at things. So I'm excited to do a reaction video on a video he posted quite a while ago. It was actually 3 years ago, but it's titled How to Read Faster. And you all know how I feel about reading fast. I'm definitely a proponent of slowing down and thinking and giving your brain the time to make connections, take notes, and really process so that you can apply what you read. That being said, I love Mark's work and I'm interested to see how he approaches this topic. So let's get into it and we'll chat along the way. Here we go.
These are all the books that I read in 2010, 10 years ago. That's 14 books. Not too bad. But these are the books I read in 2020. Shit.
Okay, so just stopping here for a minute, Mark is clearly making a visual statement that his strategy will help you read potentially hundreds of books a year. He is making the visual display here of going from 14 books to quite a lot, and they're falling all over themselves, which I think is hilarious. I see this a lot in booktube, and I don't think Mark is necessarily guilty of what most booktube teaches, which is simply to read fast, just to get through the books. He's quite a well-rounded, learned guy, and I think he spends a lot of time reading. So I'm interested to see what he says and what his strategies are. All right, here we go.
Watch this video to get 5 tips on how to read more books each year and how to remember what the fuck you read.
Okay, so if you've never watched any of Mark's videos, he loves the F word, as is in the title of pretty much every book he writes, which really got him some attention. But again, his message is always so unique that it's worth it. And he's going to give us 5 tips, it sounds like. So let's see what the first one is.
What's up, everybody? Mark Manson here.
His tagline for his blog is "Life Advice That Doesn't Suck." Yep. Most of the things he say really don't suck, and they're worth checking out.
Harry S. Truman once said that not all readers are leaders, but all leaders read. There's a reason that reading has been around for 5,000 years. It fucking works. It makes you smarter, makes you more empathetic, makes you more self-aware, entertains the shit out of you. I mean, what else could you want? Reading is one of those things that everybody seems to wish they did more. If you don't read any books, you wish you read a few. If you read a few books, you wish you read a lot. And if you read a lot, then you're really aware of all the cool stuff that you don't have time to read. Since my job is to just read stuff all day.
So I love this idea that he's pointing out that once you've read a couple books, you kind of get a taste for it and you want to definitely increase that reading volume. It's a little addicting. Actually, it's quite addicting. But I also like how he points out that once you've read quite a few books in, say, the course of a year, really what happens is you're exposed to all the stuff you don't know, and it becomes almost a craving to just dig in and see what's out there. So yeah, reading is, it's more than a hobby. It's definitely a lifestyle. I think there's a big difference between hobby and lifestyle here. This is something that becomes you. You become a reader, and you're going to be the kind of person that's bringing books with you everywhere because there's just not enough time. And you'll find that there's not enough time to read all of the books. And so something I always teach is to try and be a little selective when you read a book. I give every book 50 pages before I set it down if I'm not interested in it. But let's carry on and see what he says here.
Since my job is to just read stuff all day and then regurgitate it to people with poop jokes and F-bombs, I figured that I would sit down and go through some of the biggest things that have helped me become a better reader over the years and help.
Okay, yeah. So Mark, first of all, you got to get used to his humor. If you're not used to the crass language, get used to it because he is very open with that. But also, he pointed out that he does this for a living. He reads for a living. Now, that's something that you probably don't have at your disposal, which is fine. I don't read for a living. People aren't paying me to read because I'm not a writer. We don't have that luxury. I think it's really important before we get into these 5 tips that you don't compare your reading list to Mark's. Again, in the beginning of the show, he piled up hundreds of books on the table. Well, if you've got all day to read books, you probably could do something similar. But many of us only have 20 minutes, 30 minutes a day, and you shouldn't beat yourself up for that. That's a very significant amount of time if you spend it reading well and with intention.
You read more books and read better books. And at the end of the video, I'm going to talk about how you can remember more of what you read, and you'll be surprised. It has nothing to do with a highlighter or taking notes. All right, so tip number 1.
So I'm interested in that concept. He's attaching not just how to read more books, but also how to remember what you read, which is quite intriguing. He's pointing out, again, being contradictory, where we don't need a highlighter or taking notes. Don't know that I agree with that, but we'll see what he has to say. As you know, I am a big note taker. In fact, I am the founder of highlightish.com. It's a tool I use to keep track of my own book notes. I'm a big fan of reading. In fact, there is a phrase: the weakest pencil is stronger than the greatest mind. Right? You can simply write something down and really lock it in. So, big fan of note taking. But I'm curious to see his approach.
Cut the inner monologue. This is probably something you don't even realize that you do. Most people don't. But when you read, there's that little voice inside your head talking out each and every word to you. For instance, you might read, "The man turned and deceptively smiled, acknowledging the expectations upon him, even though he had no intention of fulfilling them." The reason you read these words aloud to yourself in your own head is because that's how you learn to read. When we're little snot-nosed kids, we're taught.
True, right? When we were kids, we were taught to read out loud. Our voice was a tool that we used to process the words, to understand the way the sounds were made, and that stuck with us. Now, I am not necessarily against that form of reading. I have found in my own personal life that I encourage the inner monologue. So I'm already contradicting Mark here a little bit. He clearly wants you to turn off that inner voice in your head so that you can process words faster. This is a typical speed reading technique. So it feels like this video is going to lead into some speed reading ideas, which I am not a big fan of. I think speed reading is great for getting through material quickly, but what's the point of reading if you're not giving your brain time to make connections with ideas? Maybe I'm just slow. I don't know. Maybe I require more time with concepts. But if I'm reading a book that is truly important to me and has something valuable to say, I personally need the time with my brain to think, okay, well, what is he saying to me? How does that relate to other ideas I already think I know to be true, or other research I've done? And that's when I've always felt I've learned the most. If I move through a text rapidly, I can understand the basis of the idea, but no new connections are made. Anyway, I digress. Let's keep going.
When we're little snot-nosed kids, we're taught to sound out each and every syllable and each and every word. And so we develop this mental habit of enunciating every single sound in our minds as we read. Now there's a problem with this. It's fucking slow, and you don't need to do it.
It's true. It is quite slow. Again, Mark likes to use the expletive language here, but I don't know that slow is bad. I don't know why we have such a strong need to be fast all of the time, judging ourselves and always trying to be more effective and always trying to do more with less time and fewer resources. Maybe it's better to actually slow down and embrace that slowness and, I don't know, heaven forbid, enjoy the book.
I don't need to sound out deceptively to know what deceptively means. I'm fucking 36 years old. I know what deceptively means.
Yes, I know what deceptively means when I see the word, but by saying it in my head, it slows that time clock down again and allows my brain, again, to make connections with other ideas in the book or with other books that I've read. So it's a separate benefit. I think one that's quite valuable.
What's incredible is that you can quickly train yourself to turn off your inner monologue. Try it. Try reading something without sounding out the words in your head. You'll find that your eyes can actually move much quicker than the little voice in your head can move. Now, this is weird at first, and of course it takes practice, but as you get better at it, you will naturally find your reading ability to speed up. Tip number 2.
Okay, so before we get into tip number 2, he's correct that once you cut out the inner monologue, you really do read quickly. And if that's important to you, then you should try it. And definitely, whether you ascribe to my way of reading or Mark's, you should give this an experiment. If you struggle with turning that voice off, one of the things you can do is to turn on sort of an inner hum. So instead of sounding at the words, try to do this in your brain. Like you're just making that dull noise. And that might help you in the beginning to cut out all of the words and to just kind of move through the sight of the images. And eventually you can turn that hum off and you'll notice that your inner monologue is gone. Me, though, I encourage it. I like to hear the words.
Read with your finger. Now, this one sounds weird, and you're gonna feel like a doofus sitting there with your computer screen, moving your finger back and forth, but it's surprising how much it helps. Now, the reason for this is that our eyes are actually not completely stable. Now, when we read text that's in front of us, our eyes kind of naturally jump around, and it takes mental effort to keep our eyes focused on each line. This is why a lot of times when you're reading, you lose your spot. You forget which line you're on. You read the same line twice. Sometimes you read a line and your brain will insert the word from below into the sentence that you're reading. It's because our eyes do not move perfectly horizontally. But if you put your finger below the words as you read, it gives your eyes something to focus on and move with, and it stabilizes them.
Yeah, so this is also true and works very well. It's something that I do. I like how he pointed out that you're going to feel like a doofus. It's an interesting choice of word, but it's true. My goal, though, isn't so that I can read faster. It sort of connects me with the word on the page, and I can go as fast or as slow as I want, but it allows me to really hone in on that idea, and it helps me get rid of some of the distractions. Because if I'm just reading a book and I'm leaning back in my chair, I can see peripherally wow, that was a big word for me today. Good job, Eddie. Peripherally. Anyway, I can see people around me, cars honking, the whole thing, right? But when I come in here with a pen and I'm looking at the tip of the pen as it goes across the words, it just really zones me in and allows me to make even greater connections with what I'm reading. It's simply better to read one book a year and rip it apart and apply it in your life and become a better person than to have read 100 books quickly and have achieved some sort of, thing, whatever. But I do like to use a pen or a highlighter.
And surprisingly, this makes you read quicker. In fact, a lot of people, just by using their finger to scan the text, can improve their reading speed by up to, 20, 30%. I just made that number up, but it's a lot. You'll notice when you try it. Using your finger to scan as you read, it works for everything. You can use it with a book, you can use it on an iPad, you can use it on a computer screen. Yeah, it feels weird, but it helps. All right, tip number 3.
All right, so just to wrap this tip up, he is correct that it will help you read quickly, like I mentioned before. And I've tried this as an experiment, and I definitely increased my reading speed a lot. If I wanted to, I can really get going. But I haven't added anything to my notes. I haven't added anything to my research. I definitely haven't made any higher level thoughts applicable to the work that I do. And so to me, it feels like reading is a little bit of a waste of time. Like, why am I doing this? It's just not useful to me personally.
This one's just a little bit more meta and practical. Stop reading shit you don't like.
Amen, Mark. So, okay, this is so good. Stop reading stuff you don't like. Fully agree with this one. I don't know why we read books that we hate. I think we do it for ego reasons. We want to say that we read Plato. I personally really enjoy reading Plato, but you might hate it. So why are you reading it? Because it makes you feel smart? I don't know. You're going to have to read books you don't like, maybe because of work or school. Can't help you there. But maybe what you could do is try taking a chapter out of Ali Abdaal's new book. That's this one, Feel Good Productivity. Now this video isn't about this. I am digressing again. But quickly, the idea here is if you have to do something, try to find a way to make it feel good. So one of his suggestions is he likes to play music from Lord of the Rings because he likes to pretend he's a hobbit going on a quest when he has to do something he hates. So maybe next time you're reading a book that you just have to read, do it in the form of a hobbit. Okay, let's get back to Mark here.
It's amazing to me. I run across this all the time, but people have this idea with books that if you start a book, you have to finish every single page or else you're a fucking loser, an idiot, and a failure. I don't understand why people have this attitude. You don't keep watching movies you don't like. You don't keep watching TV shows you don't like. You skip YouTube videos that are boring. Why do you force yourself to read a book that's not good?
That is so good and so true. I've never thought of that. But with every other media, we just turn it off or skip it if it sucks, right? So if a TV show sucks, you're not going to watch it. You're going to quit. Even a show that has 4 or 5 seasons, if you get into season 2 and it starts to go downhill, you just quit, right? We don't stick with it. And I love this, but there's something about a book that says, well, I paid the price and I've started, I'm on page 3, now I just have to finish. Why is that? That's dumb.
It makes no sense. Again, I think some of this comes back to our schooling. In school, you are graded based on how much of the book you read. To get a good grade, you have to read all the book. Life does not work that way. Take it from a nonfiction author, most nonfiction books are full of crap. The average nonfiction book has 2, maybe 3 useful chapters in it. Most nonfiction books are glorified blog posts, repeated over and over and over for 200 pages. If I'm reading chapter 1 and I get the idea, and then I get to chapter 2, and the author's basically just restating the idea from chapter 1 in a different way, I fucking skip chapter 2, I go to chapter 3. And then if chapter 3 is repeating the same idea in another way, I skip that one too. In fact, most books, if I realize that they aren't dense with valuable information, I just go straight to the table of contents and I ask myself, which chapters look interesting? Oh, chapter 1, 3, 7, and 14. Okay, I'll read those. And then if I read those and they're great, maybe I'll go back and look at another chapter or find something else to read. But if not, that's fine. I'd say half of the books that I end up reading, I probably read half of the text.
But I love it. I love the idea or almost the permission that he's giving us. And I kind of need the permission, right? Because as he's mentioned, we've been programmed since school to finish the book so that we can do the book report. To say we read all 416 pages so that we can get a good grade, that's ingrained in our brains. I agree with that. But I love the idea that he's saying, you know what? If chapter 2 is the same as chapter 1, I'll skip it. I actually do that quite a bit. And what I will do in nonfiction work is, if it's just repetitive, I like going to the table of contents and highlighting the most important parts and starting there and reading those chapters carefully. There's no shame in that, right? Now, it's different for fictional books. You need to read every word there in order to understand the story, or you'll be very lost. But in a nonfiction world, he's right. There's a lot of crap out there, and you shouldn't spend your time reading all the dumb chapters. Just get to the stuff that matters and move on. But when you do read a chapter that matters, please read it well. Slow down, take notes, and let's start making some of those connections.
In them, maybe less. And you shouldn't feel bad about this. The point of reading is to serve you, not for you to serve the book. Similarly, if a book is just bad, fucking put it down. Move on to the next one. I have a personal rule. I always read at least 10% of a book before I decide whether to put it down or not.
I like this. My rule is 50 pages, which is a bit arbitrary. His 10% is maybe a little more interesting because some books are longer than others. But it is important, I think, to give yourself a stopping point or a judging point to choose before you give up on a book. Because some authors are just slow to get started. Others get right to the point. But I've read books that are slow to get started that have changed my life, and I'm glad I stuck with them. It took 50 pages to figure that out.
If it's a 200-page book, I give it 20 pages. But if I hit 20 pages and I'm not into it, I look at the table of contents, nothing looks interesting, I put it away. I'd say for every 2 books that I buy and I read, there's 1 book that I buy and I end up not reading because I just don't really like it. And I don't feel guilty about that. Finally, what you'll find when you start reading more and more is that a lot of nonfiction stuff repeats itself. So at this point, I've probably read like 100 psychology books. And what you discover is that there are maybe half a dozen seminal studies in the field of psychology. Major breakthroughs in the field that get repeated all the time. If I have to read about the fucking marshmallow test one more time, done by Walter Mischel in 1972, I'll fucking gag. So when I'm reading a book and I come across, oh, it's the marshmallow test, skip 5 pages, go on to the next thing. You'll find all the time that authors use similar anecdotes, they use similar examples, they use similar stories, and when you keep running into these things over and over again, just skip them. You already know what's in them.
True. Especially in specific fields like psychology. I like his point that after reading hundreds of these psychology books, really 6 are seminal and have changed the way we think. Everything else is just regurgitating those ideas. Definitely puts emphasis on the idea that we should be a little choosy about what we read. We should definitely do some research on a book before we just decide to buy it and flip through its pages.
You already know what's in them, so why read it again? For some reason, out of these 5 tips that I always give, this one is the most surprising and most difficult for people. I don't understand why people have so much emotional attachment or judgment based on how many words in a book that they read. For nonfiction, if you're reading every single word of every single book, you're doing it wrong. Now for fiction, it's a completely different story.
I don't necessarily agree with that. A lot of nonfiction books I read word for word. One, because I have a great respect for the author, and I feel like the time that he or she put into that book is valuable and well-researched and well thought out, so I'm going to spend the time sitting at their feet, learning from them. But, like he says, if it starts to get repetitive or they reference stories you've already read before, that's okay to skip.
No pun intended. If a fiction book's good, you read every word. If a fiction book's bad, you fucking stop and put it away. All right, tip number 4. Schedule your reading time. Now, everybody I talk to who wants to read more, they all say the same thing. But Mark, I'm so busy. I don't have enough time. You should see my schedule. It's no excuse. Reading is the easiest, most transportable hobby or interest or activity that you ever. It's so fucking easy.
I'm going to hit pause here for just a second. He's making the argument, of course, that reading can be done anytime, anywhere, in line at a grocery store, at the doctor's office, whatever. I fully agree with that, but there are different levels of reading. The idea is that there's not just one way to read a book, and some books require really in-depth insight and time to get the necessary information out of them. And so it is a little off here for me in saying that reading is very transportable, because if I'm reading, again, Plato, I'm reading The Republic right now. Here it is. This is not a book I can generally read in the grocery store and feel like I'm getting everything I need out of it. So to read a book like this, I feel, for me, that I need to be at my desk with my reading kit, all my highlighters and everything else, have my notebook in place. Here's my philosophy notebook where I write things down, and my laptop, so I can put things in highlightish that are really, really important for my research. Reading at that level is definitely not portable, and I love his tip where he's saying you should schedule time to do reading, because if you are reading at a deeper level, it really needs to be an activity that is important to you, important enough to be calendared, and spend time at it. I would suggest 60 minutes a day if you can figure that out to really dig into these difficult books. Now, if you're reading Stephen King or, whatever, those can be read at the doctor's office enjoyably, and you don't need tools and thought process. You can just enjoy. So this kind of depends on what you're reading and how you're reading.
It's so fucking easy. You can read on your commutes in the morning or listen to an audiobook. You can read on your lunch breaks. I always have an article or a book to read while I'm eating lunch. I often take a book to the gym and read in between sets, or even during sets. Hell, if the books you're reading are big enough, you can...
Mark's a total nerd. This is why I love his channel. Everything he does, he definitely doesn't care what you think. And he is just, it's more important to him to get his message across than to be taken seriously. And I love him for it. I am truly grateful for his work.
Enough, you can do sets with the books. Hell, sometimes I keep a book in the bathroom so I can read while I take a shit. I play a little game with myself. I try to read more pages than I have flushes. I call it poop for pages. That might be the stupidest thing I've ever said on camera. And this doesn't even get into scheduling time in your day. Even without scheduling anything, I can easily find at least 30 minutes a day to read. And then if you schedule time on top of that, it's an easy 60 minutes, at least. And this is what people don't understand. Like, people see that I read all these books and they
Yeah, I think 60 minutes is a really good marker because for me especially, I find that it takes me a few minutes to get into a task. Whether it's work-related or reading a book, I can't just start at optimal fluency, right? I have to ramp up. I have to warm up the engines. And the first couple pages I spend reading, I've got the monkey brain going. I'm distracted. I'm thinking about work and email. But when I get my pen in hand and I start taking notes, eventually I get into that student mode and it becomes an enjoyable process. So I really think 60 minutes is a great time target to hit if you want to take your reading more seriously.
It's an easy 60 minutes, at least. And this is what people don't understand. Like, people see that I read all these books and they think I'm like superhuman or something. I'm not superhuman. My reading speed isn't that.
That's interesting, since he suggested that we use fingers and cut out the inner monologue. His first two tips were about speed reading, and now he's saying he doesn't really read faster than the average person, which most people are between 200 and 300 words a minute, which is about a page every minute or so, I think, somewhere in there. And if that's him and that's where he's at, then he's right there with me, and that's great. We have something in common.
Much above the average reading speed. The trick is consistency. The average person can read a page in roughly about 2 minutes. So if you read 60 minutes per day, that's 30 pages a day.
So these kind of formulas are a little dangerous, I think, because we are a goal-setting society. These formulas can be dangerous because now you're sitting down saying, oh, good, okay, if I read 30 pages a day, that means I can read X number of pages a month, which equivalates into so many books a year. That's how many books I'm going to read. Well, maybe, again, if you're reading Stephen King, 30 pages a day, a day is quite doable. But if you're reading Plato's Republic, 30 pages a day of this, you're going to melt your brain. And so I think it's more important not to set a page goal per day, but again, just to go back to that 60 minutes of reading time a day. The goal being that at the end, you will have truly learned something, and more importantly, applied it to your life.
And if you figure the average book is about 300 pages, well, now you're reading a book every 10 days, or 37 books per year. But if you're being smart and you're putting away shitty books and you're skipping shitty chapters, then you're gonna end up reading way more than that. You're gonna end up reading like 40 or 50 books a year. And that's just by dedicating an hour a day.
Okay, so I agree. I just don't like that way of thinking personally. Like I mentioned, I think reading isn't about checking off boxes or setting goals. It's about learning. It's about growing as a human being and a person. Again, if you read one book a year, but it changed your life and you improved your career, you became a better father or mother, you learned a new philosophy, whatever it is, that is well worth your time, and you should be proud of that. You don't need to read hundreds of books a year to be an improved person.
All right, and tip number 5, read more than one book at a time.
Okay, so I'm excited to see what he has to say here. I always read more than one book at a time, mainly because I am a distractible human. I find a lot of interests in my head. And so having multiple books going allows me to sort of nourish all of those interests and stay excited about life and about these books. I always have a fictional book that is just fun that I read at night when I go to bed. I always have a nonfiction book going that is going to take a long time to get through. One that requires definite levels of note-taking, using highlight-ish in my notebooks and everything else, because I want to learn something interesting. And then I'll usually have a third book in there that's just based on interest, something I want to learn, something I'm excited about. Books like Ali Abdaal's book or Mark's book. These kinds of books are kind of, easier to read, but they're fun and they're inspiring and they're motivating and all that stuff. That's usually where I'm at. I've usually got 2 or 3 books at least going.
This is another one that people have a lot of weird beliefs about, like the idea that reading 2 books at the same time is twice as mentally challenging as reading 1 book at a time. It's not. Actually, it's easier than reading only 1 book. Why? Because when you get sick of that first book, you just move to the second one and it feels exciting and new again. And then when you get sick of the second one, you go back to the first one. I actually find it much easier to sustain my attention and excitement for both books if I'm able to jump back and forth between them. I generally try to read 3 books at any given time, and I divide them up into 3 categories in my head. I have kind of the philosophically and technically challenging book. I have just a general nonfiction educational book. Then I have like a light fiction or a biography or something like that. I see it as like my fun book.
All right, so there you have it. So Mark and I have a similar reading strategy. Technical, interesting, and fictionally fun, right? That allows me to cover all of my bases, continue learning, and be excited and entertained at the same time.
Sometimes if the philosophical book is very challenging and requires a lot of mental effort, I'll schedule time in my day to actually sit down and read that philosophical book. If I'm reading a novel and it's really fucking good, sometimes I'll just screw the whole morning and read my novel. Sometimes I just get sick of one of my books and I set it down for a week or 2. Then I come back when I'm more mentally refreshed. All right, so we've got some basic tips on how to read quicker and more efficiently. We've got tips on how to be ruthless in your book selection, and also how to be more practical in terms of finding time during the day to read. Now let's talk about remembering what you read.
Okay, so we have gotten through the 5 tips, and now we're going to get into remembering what you've read. This is the part I'm most interested in. If you remember in the beginning of the video, he suggested that we don't need to rely on highlighting or taking notes in order to remember what we've read. Now, I don't have a photographic memory, so I'm curious to see what his method is.
Because one of the most common questions I get from people is, what is your note-taking system? How do you remember all this stuff? How do you know where you saw what study? People like to assume that I've got this like massive database of notes with like a supercomputer linking like 800 different concepts and ideas with sources and citations. No, I don't use any of that stuff.
So I do. I definitely do use that kind of studying tool in place because I definitely cannot remember the critical things. Now, I can remember if I pick up any book, let's go Mark's book. If I put this on the shelf and then I look at it and pull it off, I can remember probably the 2 or 3 major themes or ideas and go, oh yeah. I remember that book and I could talk intelligently about it, hopefully intelligently. That's giving myself a lot of credit. But you get the idea. However, there are several little gems in here. Within any book, there could potentially be 20, 30, or 50 little gems that could be used in my writing, on my essays, in my presentations at work, how I parent my kids, things that I truly want to use and remember that I don't want lost in this book just because I didn't write them down. So I definitely need to leverage a tool to help me remember those things. Clearly, Mark doesn't believe in that.
In fact, I use almost nothing. And this actually, let's call this the harsh truth of the day.
I'm almost afraid for what he's about to say. Let's see what this is.
The harsh truth of the day is that highlighting and note-taking is basically worthless. This upsets a lot of people.
It upsets me. I'm not gonna lie.
And again, I don't fucking know why. Why would you want to highlight a book? Like that sounds really annoying. Again, this comes from school. In school, the reason you thought highlighting is important or note-taking is important is because you were tested on what you read. People mistake the highlighting for memory. Studies have consistently shown highlighting, underlining, notes in the margin, this has no effect in your retention.
Looking at those studies, it did seem as though the sources were blurred out and just the title was shown. I would argue that there are probably far more credible studies that actually do support the idea of note-taking and highlighting and conceptual and thoughtful learning over simply reading and remembering what's important. So yeah, I would love to see the studies and read through them.
The point of doing it was so that when you went back and studied for the test, you knew what to look at. Now, some people say, well, you can do the same thing.
Isn't that the point though? Like, life is a bit of a test, and I'm reading these books for a reason so that I can grow and improve. And there are going to be moments in my life where I'm going to need to, for example, understand my finances better. So if I go back to The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel, I want to be able to open that book and look at the highlighted sections or my notes and be like, oh, right, so that I can use it. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? I don't know.
Now, some people say, well, you can do the same thing with books you read for fun. You can highlight all the cool parts, and then a month later you go back and you check all the parts you highlighted so you can remember. Well, that sounds fucking awful, because now you're just doing school in like real life.
So clearly, Mark has a different learning style than myself and other people, and that's perfectly fine. We all come to knowledge in our own way. Mark is somewhat being scholastic learning. I definitely am a huge fan of going to college and getting a degree and studying a specific form of interest. So I love school. Which is why I'm taking the Yale course, because I love studying and note-taking and what have you. So I don't think it was for him. Something tells me he didn't enjoy school growing up.
Why would you do that? Here's the thing about human memory. We remember things that we use. If I read a book on nutrition, the way I'm going to remember what I read is by actually changing what I eat and paying attention to what I eat. If I just highlight the whole nutrition book and then I eat the same garbage I always eat, I'm not going to remember anything. Basically, we remember what's useful. If you don't find ways to implement the ideas you read into your life in some way, you're not going to remember them.
All right, so I love this argument, and I fully agree with him that you're going to remember what you use. And in fact, that's why we're reading books, is to change or level up our lives or to turn things off that shouldn't be there. But again, there are lots of little nuggets that I don't want to lose in a book, that I want to have at my disposal. A quote is a great example. Sometimes I'll read a book and it will have a quote by another author, what have you, and I think, man, that is a really great quote. I like quotes. So if I highlight it, that's not something I can necessarily use to change my life, but I can definitely have it for inspiration and writing and everything else. So I definitely agree with his point here, but I feel like there's a lot of information that is lost without a note-taking system.
And you're gonna have this feeling of like, wow, I read all these books and I have no idea what's in them. Yeah, because you didn't fucking do anything.
Okay, so you read a lot of books and you don't know what's in them because you didn't make changes in your life. I agree. But you also don't know what's in them if you didn't take time to think about them and to take notes. If you just read the book quickly, set it on the shelf, and made a couple changes, you're going to have forgotten a lot of the book. You'll only remember the core tenets, which I would argue is a bit of a shame, right? There's just so much great knowledge in some of these books. Now, that's not the case with every book. Some books, like Mark pointed out, are stupid and should be thrown away. Totally agree. Those don't need note-taking.
Ultimately, the only reason to read nonfiction is to change your life in some way, is to become smarter in some way, to improve yourself in some way. Now, here's the thing. A lot of books, it's kind of hard to use what you read. I mean, even in my own books, it's about concepts and principles. You know, it's not like, oh, go out and do X, Y, Z, and then you'll make $1 million. Like, there's none of that stuff in it. So this idea of like using stuff that you read, it's actually kind of a nebulous, abstract thing. I can read a principle and my using it can simply be having a different perspective on an area of my life than I had before. For example, when I read Kant's moral philosophy, I found his ethical principles to be very profound, and I was able to see how they apply to a lot of my beliefs about people and relationships and ethics in general. And so a lot of times using something we've read, it just happens in our mind. But still, we have to make that mental effort. We have to go through that process of saying, okay, I read this, how does this apply to my own life?
You know, not all books have actionable steps in them, and those books are a little harder to sort of encapsulate in our memory what should be read. And he's bringing up Kant here, which is a fantastic place to spend your philosophical reading time if you're interested in that. But that kind of book, again, is not full of, hey, today go out and do these 7 things and you'll be happy. It's more of a, we're talking about complicated issues in these sorts of books. And I sort of don't hold with his argument here that you can read a book like Immanuel Kant's work and not take any notes and not highlight anything and come away fully remembering all of the critical details. I'm just not as smart, but I am a big fan of the notebooks and the pens and the digital note-taking systems. Yeah.
Now, if you are really dead set on like having a hack to remember the stuff you read, there are ways to kind of trick your brain into thinking that you are using the stuff you read so that you remember.
We all like hacks, right? Everybody wants a hack for everything. So let's see what he says here.
You remember it better. One of them is to simply talk about the ideas to somebody else. So you read a really cool book about neuroscience, go find a friend or somebody else who's willing to be bored to tears and describe to them what you just read.
Okay, yeah. This is true. If you read something with the perspective of being a teacher on that topic, you will inherently remember more of it, if not all of the critical qualities in that text. And a great example of this is I run a book club online, and the books that I present to that group of people are far more ingrained in my soul and in my memory, and we actually discuss these topics. They get even more ingrained in my lifestyle and in my memory and become more important to me. So I agree, but we don't all have a person to talk to, especially if you're reading something challenging. He pointed out you need somebody who is willing to be bored to tears, yes, but you also need somebody who will listen for more than one session because you're going to read more than one book. So one thing you can do if you're not surrounded by people who are also interested in these topics is to turn that conversation into writing. If you can write an essay about what you've read and share your opinion on it, this is also another great way to sort of ingrain these ideas.
The human mind remembers what's useful, and generally humans tend to see social interactions as the most useful and important things that happen in our lives. So when you tell somebody else about an idea, your brain is subconsciously saying, oh, this must be really important. Now, the last thing I'm going to say about remembering stuff is that you don't have to remember every idea from every book you've read. You only have to remember what ideas are in every book that you've read. So, speaking of neuroscience, there's this famous neuroscientist.
Seems a little strange given the previous advice, where he's saying you don't have to remember every idea, just remember the kinds of ideas in that book. But if you haven't been taking notes or highlighting anything, how will you find the specific ideas to apply them in your personal life? Change takes time, right? In order to become a new person, to apply something new, it could take you weeks, months, or years to actually become what a book is teaching. And that means you're going to have to go back to that text as a study guide for life and turn to its advice and try to grow and improve. And some books have to be read multiple times so that you get the deeper meaning out of it. Well, if you don't take notes, I just don't see how that's possible.
So, speaking of neuroscience, there's this famous neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio. I've read 2 of his books. I couldn't explain off the top of my head exactly what's in his books. I'm not a neuroscientist. It's not my area of expertise. It's not a piece of knowledge I use frequently. But I remember the arguments in those books, and so I know where to look if I need to find those neuroscience arguments again.
Mark has the ability to go to specific books and know what they were about, which I think most of us could do if we read the book, but then quickly get to that section and pull what he needs from it. I personally like just having a note-taking system I can turn to. That's just me, but each to his own.
So the importance is not necessarily remembering everything you read, it's remembering where you read it. Because when you need something, you can just go grab the book off the shelf and find it. It takes 2 minutes. I do it all the time. 90% of the stuff in my articles and books, it's because I grabbed shit off the shelf and I went looking for it. I'm like, oh yeah, there is that thing. There's that experiment. Let me write about that. The only reason to try to obsessively remember every single thing you read is if you want to impress people at parties. And let's be honest, who the fuck wants to impress people at parties? All right, that's a wrap.
Okay, so that's the end of the video, and I think overall I really liked this video. I like that Mark's encouraging us to read more and spend time with books. He clearly cares about books and the quality of his reading time. I don't necessarily agree with all of the tips that he suggested, but I think his heart is in the right place and he is just a fantastic author. I highly suggest you pick up any of his books, this one being his biggest bestseller, and it is quite a transformational book. You should spend time reading it slowly and taking notes on it so that you can actually make some changes in your life. All right, hey, if you found this video helpful, I would really appreciate giving it a like or send me a comment. I would love to know what you're reading right now down below, and we can chat. I respond to every comment. I'm interested in the books that you're reading, how you're making that reading time meaningful, and why you love to be with books. So until next time, thank you for watching, happy reading, and never stop learning.